Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. This is Dara Taylor. So this is a straight gown with a peplum flare at the down. It is a two-step peplum flare. So if you're interested on how I made this, keep watching. So this is a sequence material, and also this is called a damask material. So I'll be combining the both together. So for the making of the dress, I folded my lining into two, and the reason I'm using my lining to cut is because it will be much more easier than using the sequence materials to cut it. I measured out my shoulder width. My shoulder width was 15 inches. I divided by 2, giving me 7.5. I came down by 1 inches for my shoulder slope, and then beneath the shoulder slope I came down by 7 inches. 7 inches represents my armhole length, so I'm just marking it across. Then I made a slope there. Which represents my armhole slope. The next thing I did was to mark my neck width, that's the neck wideness, and it gave me 3 and 3 inches. And then for the back deepness, the depth of the back, I measured out 1 inches, and I connected it together with the neck width. I connected it together. And then for the front deepness, I measured out 4 inches. I did not want this neck to be low. I wanted it to be a high round neck, so I measured out 4 inches. The next thing I'm going to do is to mark out my body measurement. And while marking out my body measurement for the bust area, I came below my armhole slope and I marked this. And then from my shoulder to my waist measurement, that's the length from the shoulder to the waist, it was 14 inches. And then from the shoulder to the hip, it was 23 inches. So the next thing I did was to connect my shoulder slope together. I connected my shoulder slope together, which is really essential. Then I marked out my body measurement. So for my body measurement, I started from the bust. I marked out the circumference of my hip. To determine your waist, your hip and your bust circumference is just the original measurement. Imagine it's 33 divided by 4, and the reason before it is because you folded the material into 4. So I already marked out my hip measurement, my bust and my waist, and I'm just connecting the lines together. Remember, it was divided by 4. That is how to determine the waist, the bust and the hip circumference. I connected it together, and the next thing I'm going to do is to add in my allowance. Whenever you are sewing, you need to add in allowance. So for the allowance, I am using 3 inches for the allowance for all sides. I marked for the bust 3, for the waist 3, and for the hip 3. So I came all down by that. That is going to form my allowance area. So the next thing I'm just going to do is to cut all this out. So guys, if you are watching this and you have not subscribed, please do like and subscribe to my channel, and also turn on your notification bell so that you'll be the first to know whenever I post a video. So I'm just going to go around to cut all this out. I went ahead to fold my damask material into 4. It's folded into 4. So for the measurements I'm going to be working with, I'm going to be cutting a 360-degree peplum flare. The measurement I'm using is my hip circumference, and the reason was because the bottom part measurement for the dress is the hip circumference. So it was divided by 4, which was giving 8 inches, right? So the next thing I came beneath the parts that I marked out, I'm marking out my length. The original length for this flare is 8 inches, but then I'm adding 2 inches extra for the folding allowance. So from the point where I marked out my chalk, which was 8 inches, I'm just going all the way down by 10 inches, trying to form another circle, right? So that's just what I'm doing. I place it from the point of my measurement, and then the next thing I'm going to do is to cut all this out with my scissors. Remember, this is a two-step peplum flare. So this is the other part of the flare. I placed the one I already cut out, and I'm just going to be following the pattern to cut it all out. After cutting it out, I'm going to be removing this first part, sorry, and then I'm going to be taking in my measurement for this one. So the measurement for this one is 8 inches. The other one was 10 inches. So I'm going to be adding another material at that other side because it was not enough. That is why you can see the shape over here. It was because the damask was not enough, so I'm just going to be adding. So I place my lining on this, and then I'm just going to be following the pattern that I drafted out at the lining part, and I'm going to be cutting it through with my sequence. That is why I said it is much more easier. So I repeated the same process front and also at the back. So this is an easier way to cut it when you're using a lace or a sequence material. So this is the back of the dress. You know, it was divided into two, so this is one part of the back. So the area I'm marking with my chalk are the areas I'm going to be sewing. This is the zip allowance area, so I'm going to be sewing all these parts all out. So after sewing this, I'm going to be turning it to the right side. I'll turn it over to the right side, then I'm going to iron it to make it to relax. You saw how I did turn it. So the next thing is to sew these sides. This side I'm going to be sewing this side. So after sewing it, this is what it's looking like. I repeated the same process at the other side of the back, and I'm going to be placing it together. You guys can see the way I place it, and I'm going to be sewing over this area, which is my zip allowance area. I'm going to be using my chalk to mark out the area that I'm sewing. So this is the area I'm sewing. So your zip allowance area should be about 1 to 1.5 inches. So after sewing it, this is what it's looking like, guys. I sewed over the zip allowance area, so this is what it's looking like. So the next thing is following the pattern, the curve of the neck for the front. I'm going to be sewing over that area also. This area I'm using for my chalk, I sew over it. So I turned it to the right side, and this is what it's looking like. And then I'm going to be sewing the side also. So this is what the neck is looking like. I'll be sewing the sides also, just to secure it together with my lining. So the next thing I did was to place my back on top of my front, and I'll be connecting it through the shoulder area. I will be connecting it through the shoulder area. So this is the way that I did connect it together, the front shoulder and the back shoulder together, but I'm pinning it down first to make it much more easier for me to sew together. You guys saw the way I turned it over to the other side while doing this. The essence of following this pattern of sewing is just to make this area neat. So if you are doing, you should follow the same pattern. I sewed over this area and I turned it over at the other side the same way I did for this other side. You guys saw the way I used the lining to turn it over, and then I'm also pinning it down the same way, repeating the same process I did also, and then I'll be sewing over those areas together. So after sewing it, this is what it's looking like, guys. After sewing it, I sewed over it. You guys can see how it's looking very neat. The sewing is not showing, so I advise to repeat the same process I did. The next thing is to be imputing our dart measurement. The essence of that is to give the cloth a fitting. So then I came down below by 10 inches. That will be the point at which my dart will be starting from. So from the point of 10 inches, I marked out 10.5 inches. So this is the length of my dart. My dart is 10.5 inches long. So to determine the wideness of the dart is your bust point divided by 2. So in here my bust point is 7 inches, and I divided it by 2, giving me 3.5 inches. So that was what I did, and I'll also be repeating the same process at the other side of it. You guys see I repeated the same process. The next thing to do, you are going to be sewing over this area. I already pinned down the area that I'm going to be sewing over. So this is what it's looking like, guys, after sewing it over, right? This is what it's looking like. So this is what it's looking like. So the next thing we're going to be doing is to be imputing our measurement. I also repeated the same process of that as the front part. So the front also has a dart with the same measurements. So then I started imputing my body measurement. I marked out from my shoulder to my hip area the length, which was 14 inches, and from my shoulder to my hip area, which was 22 inches, I also marked them out. So the next thing we're going to do is to measure out our our bust circumference. I marked it. So from the point of the zip allowance is where I am going to be taking my measurement from. You guys can see where I'm starting my tape from, the point of the zip allowance area. And the essence of that is that it tells you the center part of it, so that when you finish sewing it, the both sides will be equal. The zip will be at the middle of your back and not it will not shift to the side. So that is the essence of starting your measurement from the point of your zip allowance area. So if you don't do this sometimes, you see that the zip, after sewing it, your zip is going to go one side. So that is why I always use my zip allowance. It tells me the middle part of my sewing. So I connected the lines together just as I repeated at the other side. So I'm going to be sewing it. So after sewing it, this is what it's looking like. I sewed over here also, and then this is what it's looking like. I turned it to the right side after sewing it. The next thing we are going to do is to open up our peplum flare. I opened it up at one side. Remember, this is one side opening I'm doing. I'm not opening it into two but into one side. So I also opened up the other parts of the peplum flare also. I opened up the second part of my peplum flare also. So the next thing I'm going to be doing is to measure out the wideness of this peplum flare, and I'm supposed to be expecting 35 inches, which was my hip circumference measurement. But if it is above 35 inches, what I'm going to do is to print it, so you guys can see it is not 35, it is 50 inches. So what I'm just going to be doing is to print it, and I would recommend you cutting the flare to be over, because when you print it, it just gives it a much more better look. So I recommend you doing that, cutting your peplum flare over so that you'll be able to print it. You guys can see the way I'm printing it. I will just print it and sew over the area that I printed. I'm going to place this until it gives me my hip circumference, which is 35 inches. So I already went ahead to join it with the other part of the flare, giving me a two peplum flare. You guys can see the way I joined it. So I'm going to be joining it with the my dress. So this is where I'm going to join it. So the point of my joining will be at the zip allowance area. So I opened up my zip allowance area a little bit, turned the peplum flare to the wrong side, then I'm going to be pinning down the area that I'll be folding. So that is why I was talking about cutting your peplum flare to the measurement of your hip circumference, because this dress, the bottom part, is the measurement is 35 inches, which is my hip circumference. So I'm just going to be joining it with my needle, and after that I'm going to be sewing over this area. But then it's not be 35 inches, which is the length of the flare, because of your zip allowance. So you can make it like 38 inches, adding 3 more inches. So I'm just going to be pinning down all over these areas, because I will be sewing over those areas. So as it is, I already sewed it, and this is what it's looking like. So I turned it to the right side, and this is what the joining is looking like after. So you guys can see the way the joining is, and look at the point of our entry, which was the zip allowance area. So I'm also going to be sewing that area also. You guys can see I turned it to the wrong side, and then I'm just going to sew over this area. You guys watch the way I am sewing it. Before then, I am going to pin it down. I'll pin it down, which is going to show the parts that I'm going to be sewing together. So I already sewed this area. You guys can see where the thread is, and then I'll turn it to the right side so that you guys can see. So this is what it's looking like right after sewing it. You guys can see how it is neat. So the next thing to do is the hand. Cutting the hand, I folded my sequence into two, and then I'll start imputing my sleeve measurement. So the length of it is 21 inches, but I'm going to make it 22 inches for folding allowance. I marked out my 22 inches, and then for my sleeve band it is 4 inches. So I marked my inches at the point of my sleeve band. Then I made a pattern for my sleeve. As you guys can see, I made a sleeve pattern where I'm going to be imputing it with my armhole area. So beneath that, I came down to measure up my upper sleeve band measurement, which I normally call my armpit measurement, and it was 5.5 inch. I connected it together with my 4 inches, and then I also imputed my allowance area. So I'm going to be cutting all this up. So this is what it's looking like after cutting out the sleeve. So I placed it, remember what we cut out was one sleeve, so I placed it on top of another one, and then this is giving me two sleeve. So I already joined the sleeve together with my dress. So thank you so much guys for watching this video. See you on my next tutorial.